This is Polaris Live. I'm Sarwar Kashmeri, inviting our viewers from around the world to this global series of programs on China and the United States in the world. The program is produced under the auspices of the Foreign Policy Association in New York. I have great pleasure today in introducing a veteran Canadian diplomat, Deanna Horton. Ambassador Horton is a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. She is a global fellow at the Wilson Center for International Scholars in Washington, D.C., a senior fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation and at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Previously a career service officer, she was appointed as Ambassador of Canada to the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, the Canadian Embassy in Washington as Minister for Congressional, Public and Intergovernmental Affairs. She helped negotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement and served as Director, Canada's Office of the Deputy Minister for International Trade. So welcome to Polaris Live, Ambassador Deanna Horton.
Good morning, Sarwar. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on and an honor at this timely and important juncture of what's taking place in the world. So let me just get into this right away and ask you, Canada, last week became the first country besides Ukraine to remove Russia from its list of most favored nations, which means a 35% tariff now will be paid on Russian imports into Canada. The U.S. now wants the G7, largest group of economies in the world, to do the same. Now, you've pointed out that the future of North American prosperity requires Canada and the U.S. to connect to Asia's huge, burgeoning digital economy. Well, what I want to ask you is, here's Russia, which was all plugged into the world economy, and the West has literally decapitated it, removed it from the economic connections of the world. So are the countries in the West, China, India, and so on, really going to be that interested in getting as closely plugged in, continue to be as closely plugged in as they've watched what happened? What do you think?
Well, you have a wealth of questions here. I'll try and unpack those as best I can. So on the Ukraine crisis, which is truly tragic for anyone who has a diplomatic background, not to mention everyone else. So many commentators are focusing on the G7, how the G7 is banding together, which I think is great. But I think we, meaning Canada and the US, should be including our Asian partners in this, in particular, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and even Singapore. And we should be working hard to draw India into the mix, because I think this is part of the solution. Also, there was recently elections in Japan and South Korea. It's too early to tell, but I'm really hopeful that they will be able to work more closely together and ditch some of that historical baggage between them. So to some extent, the fact that China and India have not thrown their support behind the USA and other allies is a reflection of this aversion to U.S. dominance. This is a longstanding and to some extent a leftover of the Cold War. And I also think, though, that going forward, Europe is going to be playing a much stronger role. And we've seen that in terms of how they've responded to the Ukraine crisis. But I think this also bodes well for their role in Asia. So China right now is in a very difficult position. I don't know why Xi Jinping decided to throw his lot with Vladimir Putin. He didn't believe what the Americans were telling him about the impending invasion. And I think that, and the US was urging China to dissuade Russia, and they're still continuing to do so, as we saw yesterday with the meeting, Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi in Rome. And, this is an opportunity to help Russia in terms of China. But I think I'm reminded of the words of Thomas Jefferson in 1812 when he was discussing the US invasion of China. He stated that the acquisition of Canada will be a mere matter of marching. So we know it didn't turn out that way for the US, and it certainly didn't turn out that way for Vladimir Putin. So there will be diplomatic efforts to try and get China and India on board to urge Russia to stand down by the USA and its allies. And I assume they will be trying to do that in the Quad, which is US, Japan, Australia, and India. But the longer this goes on, the more difficult it's going to be.
Hey, may I interrupt and just
Sure.
ask you, Deanna Horton, when you mentioned China and Russia, I mean, there's a lot of questioning about what brings them together so closely. Do you think it's as simple as they don't want the American hegemony to continue? And I want to preface that also with a longer question, which is that when your finance minister pulled Russia out of the most favored nation status, she said, you know, if you don't play along with the rules of the rules-based global liberal order, then you shouldn't be allowed to take advantage of it, profit from it. But that's an order that the Asians, China, India, and so on, really believe was created by a small group of nations to dominate the world. And you may recall that China's top diplomat Yang Jiechi says that China will not recognize the rules made by a small number of people in the West, serving as the basis for the international order. And do you think that it's as simple as that? Russia and China now very close because they want to tailor today's order for themselves.
Well, as I think I mentioned, this whole issue of the Cold War baggage. So in terms of looking at the world, Russia wants to, if I understand correctly, wants to go back to what they saw as a balanced world. However, I think right now we have been, the era of Pax Americana is maybe over. However, I think China is going to be overtaking the US, certainly GDP-wise by 2030. And Asia is just going to continue to grow. China, I think, is conflicted at the moment. China doesn't like chaos. And even though it may not like the liberal international order and wants to change the order part of the equation is no doubt attractive to them. And they have benefited from it. So I think that they're going to have to hedge their bets. And in an ideal world, they'll want this to drag out to the extent possible, because I don't think that Xi Jinping is looking at the 20th Party Congress later this year and an extension of his term. He doesn't want anything untoward to affect that. So I think that is also part of the equation. But you're absolutely right that there are these actors. I'm speaking now of Russia and China and to some extent India. So India has also cast its lot in with Russia. It abstained on the vote to some extent. And the real challenge will be what happens on secondary sanctions, because I think that the G7 and allies have not yet thrown everything at Russia. And there is still the question of whether or not they're going to take on third countries as well. India, for Russia, is a key armament supplier for India. Probably India buys more from Russia than any other Asian country. This is, again, a holdover from the Cold War and some lingering peak at the USA for support of its rival Pakistan. And here again, Europeans may well play a larger role. So there are many interlocking elements to this, Sarwar.
Yes, and since you brought up the Quad, Deanna Horton, I want to just follow through and ask you another question. I mean, a lot of people, I count myself in that camp, believe that India is really going to hedge its relationship with America. And we are seeing some of this, as you pointed out, in the Russia-Ukraine war. right? Because, I mean, going back to the 60s, Russia has always supported India at the Security Council as the biggest armament supplier. So that's a relationship that's going to be hard to break. China is still a large investor, as we all know, into India. So do you think this idea of the Quad is kind of half baked? I mean, I realize that America wants to have this crucible of countries to oppose China, and India is the most powerful element in that, arguably. What do you think?
Well, that's a good question. And the Quad is technically not a defense. It's has a lot of different elements to it, including infrastructure, and there's a digital element to it. And I think that the U.S. is trying hard to bring India into and being ably aided by both Japan and Australia. So this is where Indo-Pacific comes into it. So Indo-Pacific starts out as a Japanese idea, and then the Americans jump onto it, add more of a defense element, and because they're looking at it as security, but also as an alternative to Belt and Road. And unfortunately, they've never really been able to come up with a real alternative to Belt and Road, but they have been. There are different elements of and initiatives, including at the G20, and Japan has been looking at quality infrastructure and actually has been assisting China to some extent. So I think that the Quad is better than not having the Quad, just as there are many other linkages in Asia, which some people might denigrate because they think that there isn't enough. It's not high level enough, and some of the requirements are not written in stone. There are a lot of exceptions. There's lots of lead time, and I'm also including the trade agreements in this, of course. So, but I think the Asian way of doing things, to the extent that you can lump Asia together, which one shouldn't do, but is let's get people in the room and talking, and the binding guidelines can come later. And that's how things have evolved. I mean, when you think about RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that had been under negotiation for years, and they managed to put it together in a time of pandemic, a virtual summit in Hanoi, and sadly without India.
Yes.
But it is still a really important grouping.
Indeed. And follow up to this is I'd like to get your views on the implications to China of the economic and trade fallout from the Russia-Ukraine war. And then I want to follow up with the second question that you can think about, which is you've mentioned earlier that Europe has come together in a way that was very unexpected just a few weeks ago. Now, I talked to an Italian friend a couple of days ago. The price of bread in Italy has doubled in a week, right? And this is happening all over the world to essential commodities. How long is Europe going to be able to keep this knot that they've pulled together, and how long is China? I mean, these are all questions we've never faced before, as especially in your field, diplomats. Can you touch on those, the economic impact on China, and then how long can the Europeans hold together?
Well, the impact on China, I think it's going to depend on what happens in terms of what I just mentioned, the secondary sanctions. But my understanding is that there are a lot of Chinese firms that have stopped doing business with Russia. And so whether or not that has a lasting impact, I'm not yet sure, because it will depend on whether or not they go ahead with secondary sanctions, which would affect China a great deal. And that would really push China into making a decision. And also, because China is the one that has leverage over Russia, perhaps the only country that does. So I think that will be critically important in going forward. But I think in terms of what Europe, it's not only Europe, but also even in Canada. I think people are now starting to look at what they took as security for granted, and they can no longer do that. So everybody from Canada, Germany, Japan, everybody's looking at their defense postures and forces and what to do next. And I think that is going to continue. I think this also, I mean, the question of how long people will be able to hold out. I think the price impacts on from commodities. Egypt is apparently the largest importer of wheat in the world. Certainly, Canada can jump in on some of this, but and I think there's been a lot of talk in the media in Canada about doing that. To what extent that's actually possible, I'm not sure. And same with oil and gas. I mean, it has to get to market, and it takes years for LNG projects to come to fruition. So that's not going to happen anytime soon. So there will be impacts, and I think we will have to all shoulder the burden. However, I don't sense any lessening, certainly in Canada. And of course, Prime Minister Zelensky will be speaking to the Canadian Parliament today. I don't see any lessening here of support for Ukraine. And so I think that is an opinion that is shared across many nations. So I think that will continue for some time, but time will tell. And I think most people here are just rooting for the Ukrainians to be able to hold out and hoping that Russia will find a way out, which is the challenge. But taking it back to Asia, Russia is also an Asian nation. However, but it's so huge that I don't know whether the far east of Russia will continue to be an important trading partner, because Russia, the economy has been shrinking. And so from China's perspective, do they want to put all their eggs into a shrinking basket, or put their eggs into the basket that is the one that's going to grow, which is the rest of the world?
Sure. And I'm reminded by what you've just said that Russia's economy is about the size of Spain's, actually, the GDP.
Yeah.
So, yes, that is true. But, Canada, I'd like to hone in, take advantage of you being with us today, Deanna Horton. Canada could really fill this void of fertilizer and oil and energy, that is being cut off because of the Ukrainian-Russian war. My question to you, therefore, is Canada and the U.S. are probably the closest, not just neighbors, but closest allies, as you know well. My question to you is, can we, going forward, look for some guidance from Canada in a way that helps America chart a more realistic global foreign policy? Canada looks very much like the United States of the world, but has its own values a bit differently, and has influenced in the past. What do you think? Is there a new relationship, not new, but is there a more polished relationship that can develop because of this horrible war?
Well, yes, I think I wouldn't overstate Canada's influence in the U.S. Having worked in Washington, I recognize how little influence we have. However, Canada, I would call it nudge influence. I think in the past we have been able to steer to a certain extent, and also we probably know the Americans better than anybody else. And so we certainly spend a lot of time explaining to other countries what's going on in Washington. And at least certainly I've done that in my career. So I think that Canada does have a role to play, and I think that Canada should be working with the United States. I think the U.S. is also recognizing the importance of its allies. What I'd like to see is recognizing more the importance of the allies in Asia, not only in Europe, but also in Asia. Because I think that in terms of how we move forward, and I do a lot of research on the digital economy in Asia, and that's certainly very large. And how we move forward when we're looking a bit longer term, Asia is going to be critical to the prosperity and growth of both Canada and the United States, because that is the market that's really growing. And there's just so much potential. And we have to ensure, this is really important, the importance of open economies, open markets, open information, and helping all countries achieve that. And we haven't even managed to do that in Canada in terms of ensuring that all of our industry and small businesses are able to harness this incredible technology in the best way possible that also protects your data, protects privacy, et cetera. So, but I think there's a lot going forward in terms of working with countries to ensure that as we develop, that we develop in the way that allows us to take advantage of this digital economy without suffering undue consequences, because there are a lot of bad actors out there, including some governments, and you want to make sure that things develop in the way that really helps everyone.
So, Deanna Horton, apply this microscope that you just have on the Canadian-American relationship to the Canadian-European relationship. Right. A lot of us, including me, have always been strong backers of the concept of the European Union. But the last 7, 8, 9 years, many have felt that that was starting to break up a bit. Now everything has come back together again. Do you think this is a permanent coming together again? And that the EU will now become more of a force on the world stage, in the sense that there will be a more integrated security policy, a more integrated foreign policy, a more integrated budgeting process, just like the euro-denominated financing that's taken place to reactivate economies after the pandemic. Do you think that that is going to continue on, or is that just a vestige of this war?
Well, I wouldn't be too optimistic that everything you described is actually going to take place. However, I would say the big change has been Germany. And I believe that now that Germany is willing to take a stronger role on the security front as well, for the first time in decades, in fact, since the end of the war, I think people were very surprised to see Germany to make that turnaround, but I think it's a good one. The EU actually has a lot of regulatory power. So, for example, the way that they have regulated the digital economy is kind of setting the standard for the rest of the world. So I think that that is going to continue to be important. The EU managing that number of nations has always been a challenge and will continue to be a challenge. So I wouldn't say that it's forming this block that is going to work in unanimity for the rest of the foreseeable future. However, I believe that that will continue in terms of being able to, being willing to play a stronger role. And I think we're going to see that in Asia as well. And I'm hoping we're going to be able to see that in Asia as well, because when you look at the US-China, the relationship and the superpower clash, because China is in many ways is already a superpower. And it's playing catch up, and it's going to overtake the US. So the US is so much stronger in so many other areas. However, when you look at the Asian countries don't want to have to make a choice. They don't want this bifurcated world. They
Right.
don't want, so having Europe in the bargain as well, I think is important, because it's another player. I think we are moving, if we are looking at a future where you have the US and US, China, India, in that order, and then China overtaking, but China and India overtaking by 2050, which is the prediction. So looking way out, we're going to have, I'm assuming, what will be more of a multipolar world. And I think that is a good thing. We don't necessarily want to move to yet another bipolar world where you'd have the US and China, and certainly Asian countries who are really affected by everything that happens in both countries don't want to be saddled with that choice.
Well, I want to circle back as we start running into time issues. You've given me the perfect segue to circle back to where we started this program, which is that China is soon going to become the largest economy in the world. It also already dominates, according to most military experts, the Indo-Pacific region. America is no longer the hegemon there, as you probably know better than most people. American aircraft carriers, which is how the U.S. projects its power in the Pacific, and no longer sail within 1,000 kilometers of the Chinese coastline because of all the space cruise missiles that China has developed. So my question to you is, embedded in what you've said about China and America and India, especially China and America, these two countries have different value systems, right? China isn't about to change its value systems. It's had it for 4,000 years. Do you think then that the United States will have to adjust its value systems and therefore the world liberal order, or whatever one calls it, to take China into account and bend and not assume that democracy is the be all and end all for the entire world?
Oh, that's a big question, Sarwar. I would say that coexistence is going to be a necessity. I think you're right to point out, I don't think the US is going to change. I don't think China is going to change. The question is, can they learn to coexist? And that's where I think some of the other countries that I've been talking about, including Canada, will have a role to essentially be, I don't know whether we want to talk about democracy per se. I am more interested in, because there are different types of democracy and not everyone follows the American style of democracy. What I think is more relevant going forward is this whole concept of open markets, open access to information, which does not exist in China. That is the model that I think most countries would like to follow, mainly because in terms of innovation and developing, data is the new oil, as they say. So having access to data, being able to protect data, this is going to be really important going forward in terms of developing and making lives better for everybody. And I think Asia, I think in Asia, that is going to be a critical part of the future. So coexistence, and with countries who don't necessarily want to make it the US camp, but rather the open economies camp. I think that's the better way to look at what the options are for the future. And being able to, the value systems, China doesn't want to adopt a US value system, and there are many people in China who believe that China is on the right path. China is going to overtake the US in terms of GDP. But I think that going forward, how important will it be for China to have this kind of open economy, open access to information economy? That's a big question.
Well, Deanna Horton, we could go on forever. You have given us all, especially me, a PhD in world diplomacy in this short half hour that we've spent together. It was an absolute pleasure to have you, honor to have you, and we all learned a lot. And please come back to Polaris Live again and enlighten us some more. So thank you, Deanna Horton.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to speak to you.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. I wish we could have gone on to learn more from Ambassador Deanna Horton, but time is what it is. So, this is Sarwar Kashmiri thanking our viewers from around the world for joining us. We hope you'll join us again on the next issue of Polaris Live. But until then, goodbye.